The Baroque period laid the groundwork for the classical period to develop a solid foundation for much of modern Western music through its emphasis on structure and clarity. This period standardized the symphony orchestra and raised the piano as a prominent instrument. The Age of Enlightenment fundamentally shaped the aesthetics and purpose of classical music. Enlightenment thinkers emphasized reason, logic, and intellectual inquiry over tradition. This translated musically to a preference for clean, balanced, and orderly structures. The sonata form, with its predictable ABA structure, became a central organizing principle, replacing the more improvisatory forms of the Baroque era, like the fugue. The focus on human experience and individual rights led music to appeal to a wider audience, not just the elite. Composers like Mozart and Haydn crafted music with direct and memorable melodies that were universally relatable. Later in the era, Beethoven's music began to champion individual expression, passion, and laid the groundwork for the Romantic period. The classical period saw significant advancements in instruments, primarily through the expansion and standardization of the orchestra. The replacement of the harpsichord with the piano was a major step, and the refinement of both woodwind and brass instruments accomplished the final step. These changes allowed for greater dynamic range, expressiveness, and complexity in musical composition. Improvements in instrument design, such as the development of the piano, enabled more nuanced dynamics like the crescendo and the decrescendo. And it just gave the composers a richer palette of expression. The timpani became a standard part of the percussion section. The clarinet was integrated into the orchestra, and the flute, oboe, and bassoon were developed with improvements to their keys that allowed them to play with greater agility and more expressive control. Brass instruments like trumpet and French horn were given valves that also laid the groundwork for their increased chromatic capability. The trombone became a staple to the orchestra for power and depth. While not as dominant as in the preceding Baroque era, religion continued to influence classical music in meaningful ways. One of the main composers of the classical period was Franz Joseph Haydn. He lived from 1732 to 1809 and was an Austrian composer. He became known as the father of the symphony and the father of the string quartet for his instrumental role in developing these two forms. He did not invent the symphony, but through his prolific and innovative output of 108 symphonies, he established and perfected the classical symphony structure, particularly the four-movement form and the use of sonata form, making it the model for subsequent composers like Mozart and Beethoven. His career spanned from a choir master in Vienna to a freelance musician who traveled the world. For much of his life, he was the musical director at the Esterhazy family, a position that both isolated and allowed him to innovate. Haydn's later years saw him achieve international fame with highly successful trips to London, where he composed some of his most famous symphonies. Then a final return to Vienna where he wrote oratorios like The Creation. Haydn's love for nature was intertwined with his deep appreciation for the folk music and rural landscapes of his homeland. Born in the village of Rohau, Austria, to a family of working people, Haydn spent his formative years surrounded by the countryside. This connection to nature remained a core aspect of his musical identity, even as he later achieved international fame. His music frequently incorporates elements of Austrian folk tunes and dance rhythms, reflecting his personal connection to the rural landscape. This folk inspiration, rooted in the soil, gave his music a vibrant and direct, optimistic quality. It is said that Haydn often began and ended his compositions with a religious phrase, in nomine Domini, which means to God be the glory. Haydn said that his cheerful heart was a gift from God, which led him to serve with a joyful spirit. When asked why his church music was so cheerful, his response was, "Since God has given me a cheerful heart, he will forgive me for serving him cheerfully." Here are some excerpts of Haydn, starting with his famous Surprise Symphony and his Trumpet Concerto, and finally from the Creation Oratorio, one of the choruses called "The Heavens Are Telling the Glory of God." Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a prolific and influential composer, wrote in many genres, including symphonies, operas, chamber music, and piano concertos. He was a child prodigy. Young Mozart played for the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria multiple times, starting in 1762 when he was just 6 years old. The performances took place at the palace and also in the imperial summer residence outside of Vienna. During one of these early concerts, the young Mozart famously jumped into the Empress's lap and gave her a kiss, charming her and the entire imperial family. The young Mozart and his sister traveled and performed for emperors and empresses in Europe, including the French and Austrian courts. He later performed for the King and Queen of England, among other European royalty, during his extensive childhood tours. His performances continued throughout his childhood, and by age 8, he was performing his own symphonies for the public and royalty. Mozart died on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35, after a short illness of about 15 days. The exact cause of Mozart's death is unknown, but the official death certificate stated he died from severe malarial fever. During his final days, he experienced a high fever and swelling and a rash, and despite his condition, though, he was well enough on the last evening of his life to have friends over and sing parts of his unfinished Requiem. Here are some of his excerpts of some of his most famous pieces: The Magic Flute aria, one of his church pieces, Alleluia, and another beautiful piece that he wrote for a friend of his called Ave Maria Corpus. Eine kleine Nachtmusik was written for string quartets, and the piano concerto Elvira Madigan is one of his most beautiful pieces. Ludwig van Beethoven was a German composer whose life and music bridged the classical and romantic eras. Some say that Beethoven should have his own period of music. His career was defined by immense creative innovation and personal struggle. Most notably, his progressive and profound deafness. He was a fiery and complex figure. Beethoven's genius and resilience transformed Western music and cemented his status as one of history's most revered composers. Beethoven's work is typically divided into three distinct periods, reflecting his evolution from a master of the classical style to a visionary who reshaped musical form and expression. Beethoven had studied briefly with Haydn, and his early works followed the tradition of Haydn and Mozart, but with a unique boldness. His middle or heroic period is defined by its dramatic, emotionally intense, and large-scale compositions. Beethoven announced that he would now take a new way with his music. This is when he wrote Symphony No. 5, which famously begins with fate knocking at the door, and is a monumental expression of struggle and triumph. The works of the late period are highly introspective, experimental, and intellectually complex. With his deafness now nearly total, Beethoven retreated further into his private world, composing some of his most technically challenging and profound music, like his Ninth and Final Symphony. Beethoven's funeral on March 29, 1827, was a massive public event, with an estimated 20,000 people lining the streets of Vienna to watch the procession. The procession featured prominent musicians, a eulogy by playwright Franz Grillparzer, and an oration in Latin for the University of Vienna. He was initially buried at Walring Cemetery, but his remains were moved to Vienna's Central Cemetery in 1888, where he now rests next to Franz Schubert. Beethoven's religious life, therefore, was marked by its inner complexity and contradictions, making him a curious Christian, in the words of some historians. Here are three excerpts: the famous Symphony 5, his piano piece Für-de-Lis, and his final Symphony No. 9. In the finale of the Ninth Symphony, the singers are performing Friedrich Schiller's composition Ode to Joy, which celebrates universal brotherhood and joy. The symphony is a call to overcome hate and vengeance, embrace peace, and forgive one another. The lyrics, sung by a choir and soloists, express themes of joy, unity, peace, and a love for all humanity, famously concluding with the line, "Be embraced, you millions. This kiss is for all the world."